Hello, and welcome to a live panel discussion on bridging AI's trust gaps. My name is Gregor Struin, and I will be moderating the final discussion of the day with three highly distinguished, highly impactful, and thought-provoking speakers whose views will allow us to address the issues from different perspectives. Rediet Abebe is a junior fellow at the Harvard Society of Fellows and an incoming assistant professor of computer science at the University of California at Berkeley. Rediat holds a PhD in computer science from Cornell and graduate degrees in mathematics from Harvard and Cambridge. Her research in AI and algorithms is influenced by her upbringing in her hometown of Addis Ababa in Ethiopia and is focused on equity and justice concerns. Nigel Duffy is an Irish mathematician with a PhD in machine learning from University of California in Santa Cruz. Nigel has been at the forefront of AI for more than 2 decades and is currently a global artificial intelligence leader at EY, where he is responsible for identifying, designing, implementing, and industrializing AI technologies to transform the way the organization does business. Peter Norvig is a director of research at Google. Previously, he directed Google's core search algorithms group and was also the head of computational sciences division at NASA Ames Research Center. He is co-author of Artificial Intelligence, A Modern Approach, the leading textbook in the field, and co-teacher of an artificial intelligence class that signed up 160,000 students, helping to kick off the current round of massive open online classes. So, if you allow me a joke, not much diversity here. They're all computer scientists and based in California. I, on the other hand, come from Slovenia, Europe, and I'm a lawyer. I've been focusing on the intersection of law, technology, and information for the past 2 decades with a primary focus on judiciary. Currently, I serve as the president of CAHAI, which is the acronym for Ad Hoc Committee on Artificial Intelligence at the Council of Europe, which has been mandated by 47 countries with a population of over 820 million to examine the feasibility and elements of a legal framework for design, development, and application of AI based on the existing standards of human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. Obviously, the AI techniques and applications which are nowadays present in different fields of life, society, and industry are all on different points of spectrum regarding potential or actual risks. Many types of application have immensely positive effects. In communication, healthcare, environment, transport, education, we've seen it today during all the discussions. On the other hand, the socio-technical context in which they operate and the problems that they are solving can have an immense impact on human lives, from issues related to right of life, privacy, freedom of expression, thought, assembly, even human autonomy, to impact on democratic institutions and right to a fair trial. Experiences of the past years have shown that this type of impact can often be quite disruptive, even destructive, and is starting to raise various ethical and legal questions. Reasons for this are different. Discriminatory results in justice and hiring systems, for example, based on past biased data, are one example. Design and interface issues contributing to airline disasters might be another. Such examples, although isolated, affect trust on various levels. At the same time, they also affect the improvements in quality of development and production. With that in mind, let me pass the microphone to our distinguished speakers and do a quick tour de table starting in alphabetical order. So let me start with Rediet. Would you agree that there are trust gaps? Do we actually have issues with trust in AI? Where do you see them? And which do you consider most important? Please.
Thank you so much, Gregor. This is a really wonderful panel to be on and a very important and very pressing topic that I'm really glad to see the community is really engaged in, but I think we have a very long way to go. So to answer your question about is there trust gaps in AI, of course there's trust gaps. That's why we're here, right? I think if there's any substantial proportion of the population that still has outstanding questions, then we still have that gap and we need to work on it. And so it's important that we continue this conversation. There's many reasons why this gap exists. I'll first say that even trying to understand why this trust gap exists is something that is relatively underexplored when you think about the gravity of the question. And so, first thing I'll say is actually just like there's still a lot of work to be done about why this trust gap exists. So, just to give you an example, at several summers back, I was an intern and I was looking at search queries and how people engage with sort of like the results that are returned to them when they're asking questions related to health. And in that process, I was relatively new to the sort of information retrieval set of questions, but in that process, I was very surprised to find how little we know about user behavior and satisfaction in searching for things when you're looking at African individuals, right? This is a massive continent. The continent has over 1 billion people. It's about a fifth of the world's population, or maybe a sixth of the world's population, and yet there's very, very little work about how people engage with searches, whether they trust the information that they're getting, what kind of information do they trust, right? And so it was just really jarring for me to see how little we know about that. And so I think this brings me to a couple of points that are broader than this one question that I mentioned to you, which is that first thing is people notice and care about what problems we're prioritizing in AI. What are the things that we're really focused on improving? What are the things that we're optimizing for? What domains are we drawing questions from? And they see whether that matches their lived experiences and what they feel are pressing issues. And there's a huge disconnect that leads to sort of a trust gap, as you've mentioned, and suspicion, which is very warranted. The second thing is also harms, right? So, like you've mentioned, there's inequitable distribution of harms, and it's not always that when we see certain harms that we react the same way. And so, which harms do we find to be not ideal but acceptable, and which harms do we pump the brakes and say we need to stop and we can't deploy this while this is happening? And I think the answers there are obvious, but I think it's important to point that out. And the third thing is that the lack of representation of certain communities, of different communities, marginalized communities in AI, is just abysmal. I mean, my gosh, right? If you're talking about academia, which is the space that I inhabit, and computer science academia more specifically, out of the 5,000 faculty that we have in North America, fewer than 100 of them are Black. And that's just one group I'm looking at, right? You can look at different racial groups. You can look at Native American and Alaskan Native. You can look at Latinx communities. You can look at, any marginalized group, and you would find the numbers to be pretty shocking. And it never ceases to shock me. And so I think people also notice who gets to work in the space of AI and who gets to call themselves a researcher in AI. And what types of questions we consider to be within the scope of AI research. And that creates a further divide in this trust issue.
Thank you. Let's move on with the same question to Nigel and then to Peter. Please, Nigel.
Great, thanks, Gregor. And great to be on this panel with Rediet and Peter. And I'll maybe take a little bit of a different lens to this. So, EY, as you know, is a global professional services firm. And so if I think about this from the perspective of our clients or companies that are thinking about deploying AI, what are the trust gaps there? And we have done multiple surveys actually of folks working in the field, and they identify trust as the biggest single barrier to adoption of AI in industry. And I think the source of that is a fewfold. One is that leadership of many enterprises doesn't really understand the technology enough to be able to calibrate the risk. They also don't necessarily understand where AI is being deployed in their organization. So AI is one of these ubiquitous technologies, maybe the most ubiquitous technology. And it's penetrating organizations in all sorts of ways. It's not just AI solutions that they develop themselves, but it's AI that is coming in as a feature or a capability as part of some new solution, or it's new features that are being added on to your HR system or your accounting system, your ERP system, that may not even be actively coming through a procurement process. So there's all these ways in which AI is getting into organizations. And today, I think many organizations don't even have their arms around the scope or the size of the problem. And so they have a hard time calibrating the risk. So I think that's one challenge. I think there are some inherent challenges with this technology, right? So, from level set for a minute on what AI is, the way I think about it is maybe from two lenses. One is it's a very broad set of capabilities that are very powerful. Things like computer vision, the ability to understand images and video, natural language processing, the ability to understand text, speech recognition, etc. So a very broad, powerful set of capabilities that most of which are built upon machine learning. Right? Machine learning is the ability to develop a capability by learning from experience or data. And so they're not developed with traditional software engineering methods. They're developed with machine learning, and that can be hard to understand the failure modes or the failure cases. And we don't yet, I think, have adequate controls as to how we manage those failure modes. So the challenge is that the technology intrinsically is complicated. We don't necessarily know where it's being deployed, and we haven't adapted the existing risk management and control frameworks to mitigate those risks. So, maybe just really quickly on that last topic, right? Most enterprises have very robust organizations to manage risk, but they aren't necessarily engaged with the AI activities, whether they be homegrown or procured. They don't necessarily have the skills, and they may not also have the skills, not just with regard to the AI technology, but with regard to these larger social justice or sociological impact questions. And so I think there's a real need to expand the diversity of voices in terms of skills and experience that we have in this conversation, but also the diversity of voices that we have in terms of those that might be impacted by these capabilities. And I think that happens across many, many enterprises. And so I think we're just at the beginning of the conversation, and I think that's part of the reason for the gap.
Excellent. Thank you for this complimentary answer. Peter, basically the same question, but maybe also in addition, can we experience also overconfidence or hype with the technology? Nigel touched upon it a bit. And misunderstanding of the technology can also lead to another winter. Could you start with the same question and maybe come to this part? Thank you.
Okay. All right. So first I wanted to say I agree with Nigel that the machine learning development process is different than traditional software process. And the machine learning process is not as mature. And so that leads to a trust problem, right? Traditional software, we've got 50 years of experience in how to make it safe and reliable and robust. And for machine learning, we have less than a decade of doing that. So that's part of the problem. Another part, and I think sometimes we get confused between trust in the problem and trust in the solution, right? So some problems are just inherently easier. So if I want to make banking software and, there's a definitive correct result where the deposits and the withdrawals should balance. And we can know if we get that right. And sure, it's complex and there's always bugs in software because of that complexity, but we know what the right answer is. If I'm trying to do facial recognition, there isn't necessarily a right answer. Is this a picture of so-and-so? Well, we don't know for sure. And so there's inherent errors there that are really because of the statement of the problem, but sometimes we blame the solution, say it's machine learning's fault, not that it's just that this problem is inherently hard. And that means we look in the wrong places, and rather, we should be looking at, let's look at the whole system, and no matter how good our software is, this is the design that's resistant to that error. And if we can't do that, have trust. So I tend to think of it in terms of 4 criteria. One is transparency. We want to know, what does the system know about me? What does it do? How does it do it? Another is agency. We want to know, is this system on my side or is it working against me? Or maybe a mixture of both. And we certainly have cases where we're interacting with software that's from a commercial entity that's trying to extract some money from me. And maybe that bargain is worth it, and I'm getting the better deal out of it, and I'm happy to engage with it. But sometimes I'm not so sure. And then the next issue is fairness. Is this system unfairly taking advantage of me, or is it making me unfairly take advantage of someone else? I want to know answers to that. And finally, it comes down just to efficacy. Does the system do a good job? And sometimes trust, we have trust just because of that, and we kind of skip all the other issues. So look at something like a camera. I say, well, here's two cameras, and this one's good, and this one's not as good, so I trust the good one. And I have no idea of the details of the image processing algorithms behind them, and nobody tried to explain them to me, but I just look at it, says this one gets better results, so I trust this one. And I think that's where we are with a lot of these things. And that leads to sort of an uncertain feeling of, I'd like to have more than that. Okay, so, and then you asked about the aspects of these winters. I think more of that comes from the press than from reality. And, the press always has to write a news story. And, when we started doing deep learning, there were all these stories about, wow, isn't this fantastic? Look at all this stuff we can do now that we couldn't do just a few years ago. And, but it gets boring writing that story. So inevitably, we're going to have to write the other side of the story, saying, look at all the stuff we can't do. So I expect to see those go back and forth. And, we've had AI winters in the past. But if you look at kind of results rather than look at the hype in the press, it's definitely not a sort of up and down roller coaster. It's more like we're making continual progress, and occasionally there's a jump in that progress, but not as much as you would expect to see if you listen seriously to the press coverage of it.
Thank you. So yes, there has been progress for 3-4 decades, but the results have been noticed only now. But this doesn't mean that it only happened nowadays. And also, you've pointed out an important issue, that the issue often lies in the inherent complexity of the problem that's being addressed and the way how it's approached, and that can influence also our perspective. Most technological advances of the past decades developed without much regulatory oversight. Self-regulation, which is existent now, depends on trust. But what do we do when doubt creeps in? There are fields of use where safety, reliability are essential. In some, market can regulate it by itself. For example, in industrial use, to a certain extent, also in autonomous vehicles. In others, loss or lack of trust can lead to eventual regulatory intervention. We've already seen it in data governance, in privacy, consumer protection, also in areas of law enforcement. In certain fields, like pharmaceuticals or biotech, this has actually had a positive effect on quality and quantity of innovation and on competition. And Nigel, you've also worked in pharmaceuticals, and Peter touched upon a couple of principles that they are following at Google, like transparency, agency fairness, efficacy. How do we ensure transparency in AI from your perspective?
Okay, it's a good question. I think maybe first touching on the regulatory question, and we recently did a pretty broad survey of regulators and industry stakeholders on their perceptions of the regulatory landscape. And it was interesting, there was this big disconnect. So regulators strongly believe that this space will be regulated and that they don't yet have the skills in-house to execute or implement that regulation. Industry believes that this space will not be regulated, that it will be self-regulated, and that regulators understand the technology well enough to kind of leave them be. And I think the reality is that there is a lot of regulation working through the system across the world today, and that regulation is going to arrive much more quickly than I think many people in industry believe. It was interesting to see today the National Defense Authorization Act, which is essentially the budget for the Department of Defense in the US, was passed by the House today, and that contains a section that requires that any AI technology procured by the Department of Defense was developed in a way that is responsible and ethical. And so I think, this is often the kind of foot in the door for regulation of technologies and spaces is it happens through this procurement lens, in particular in government procurement. So I think this is going to happen much more quickly than many people see. And I think this, in my mind, I think will be good because there is a challenge with transparency. And many industrial participants struggle with how to be transparent. How do you be transparent in a way that is meaningful to your consumers, that allows them to make informed decisions? And how do you do that without disclosing IP or commercial secrets? And one way to bridge that gap is with certification processes or audit procedures that build confidence in markets and in consumers with regard to how these technologies are being developed or used without necessarily disclosing information that might be, you might not want to disclose. And so the analogy that we think about here, obviously, is the audit of financial statements, which is how this happens in the context of financial markets. And so we think there's potentially parallels there.
Very good. Rediet, do you perhaps have any thoughts on the feasibility of explainability, especially in terms of using the AI for exacting social change?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I want to go back to some of the things that have been said. I wanted to engage with many ideas that came up, and especially Peter, what you said. I appreciate hearing your perspective on this. I had several questions. I'll just pick two of them that just come to mind immediately. So you mentioned a distinction between trust in the problem and trust in the solution, and I would actually really love to hear what you mean by problem and solution, because as a researcher, I actually think of the problem solution pipeline as a sort of there's a sort of feedback loop, right? Usually when self-explanatory, but I think usually once you've formulated a problem, you try to kind of come up with a solution that surfaces other things that you didn't understand. And so I really think of it as a cycle. So I would love to understand better how you decouple those and then reason about the trust there. And the second question, which may end up being related, is you've mentioned, if you step back and you try to look at what's happened in the past decade, there's been steady progress. And I'd love to hear what you mean by progress here. I think if you're thinking about sort of technical advances that we've made, I think there's an argument to be made there, potentially a very convincing one. But I think if you had different definitions of progress or sort of if you're coupling technical advances with other things, I don't think it's actually clear. I think some might argue even that we've been going down. So just to give you an example, for instance, if we were thinking about, I mentioned some of my work on the use of AI within the global South. I specifically focus on the African continent. There's a really troubling trend that's been going on, which is that sort of the colonial era power imbalances that remain to this day have created a system whereby a lot of African data is being harvested and used by folks based in or from the global North, and that's actually kind of really creating this very extractive system and leaving behind not that much for the continent, and also really leading the sort of advancing like very harmful narratives about the continent through the use of data. And I also think the same applies for inequality. We have wide inequality everywhere, including, say, here in the US. And if you have an AI ecosystem that's really focused on certain types of problems that privilege certain groups of people that were already sort of privileged by society, and you're further sort of improving the lives of those people, and then the harm is concentrated on those that were already marginalized, that gap is going to keep increasing, right? And so if you're looking at it from the perspective of inequality, I would actually argue that we haven't been progressing. I would argue that we've been going down over the past 10 years. So I mentioned my perspective just because I want to hear the full scope of what you were saying with regards to these two questions.
Okay, great. I'll try to respond to that. I think you have a good point that there is no such thing as a solution out of context, or even a problem out of context. We get to define those, right? So my point was, if you want to say, how do I balance my checkbook? There's a definitive answer where you're right or wrong. If you want to say, can I sort this photo into the right album? Is this my uncle or my cousin? Then there's not necessarily a right answer. There's some that people can disagree on. And so that's what I was trying to say, but I think you're absolutely right, and this is worth emphasizing, that this idea that such a thing should exist, the capability to sort photos into albums, that doesn't kind of exist ahead of time, and I guess neither does the idea that you should be able to balance a checkbook, right? We have to decide this is a problem that we want to address, and so. What I was talking about was more, once we decided to do that, which problems are easy, which problems are hard. But you have a great point that this is a societal question that we should be talking about, is what kinds of problems are we trying to solve? And once we do that, then we can say, this is the thing we've agreed we want to do. Should we do it with an AI system? Should we do it with a traditional software system? Should we do it with humans doing the labor, or a combination of humans and software? That's what I was talking about. But you're right that there's a deeper question of what should we even be doing at all. So I definitely agree with that. I also agree with your second point. Right. So I was saying, when we talk about AI winter, we normally talk about people saying, well, is AI good for anything at all? Can it be applied, or should we stop using it and do traditional software? And so that's what I was responding to. Now, there's a separate question of, once you've decided to apply a technology, is it doing good or harm? And that's what you were focused on. And again, that's really the right question we should be asking, right? So you could have a very effective technology, right? So, you look at military technologies, and if you ask the producers, they would say, yeah, we're doing great. We're progressing because we can kill more people. But if you ask the people who are being killed, you say, well, no, that's not doing great. That's going in the wrong direction. So I think there's some of that here. We talked before, with great power comes great responsibility. So if you can do more, then even more, you should be asking the question of, is that being applied in the right direction or the wrong direction? So that was responding to your points. I also want to say a little bit to the original question. And I don't know how we're going to end up in terms of self-regulation versus government regulation. But one thing I wanted to add, that there is a third possibility. And if we imagine ourselves back in the year 1894, there's a new technology coming online that's revolutionary, just as there is today, and that people fear very much, and that's the technology of electricity. And one of the solutions to that was the development of Underwriters Laboratory, which was neither self-regulation nor government regulation, but rather was a third-party certification that says, you can buy this toaster and it's not going to kill you when you plug it in. And so I think that's a third option to add to this possibility of how we're going to build trust going forward.
Excellent.
So if you don't mind,
yeah, please, Nigel.
Maybe I can just jump in and speak to Rediet's points too, because I think they're really well made. I think when we think about how to solve these problems, we often kind of abdicate responsibility to the technologists, and trying to solve these problems with things like explainability or algorithmic solutions or higher quality data, when oftentimes the root of the problem, the root of the issue, is that the problem has been misframed. Right. So an example would be where you use machine learning to target healthcare to folks who may otherwise use a lot of healthcare. And it turns out that, maybe not that surprising that leads to biased outcomes, because you're targeting folks who use a lot of healthcare who tend to be from, wealthier subpopulations. That problem could have been framed differently, right? Could have been framed differently from the outset. And perhaps it could have been framed in the context of minimize the aggregate amount of care that's applied to some population, or minimize the distribution of cost among some group of people, right? There are many ways to frame the problem that would have not led to a biased outcome. And I think the thing that we need to be careful about as a computer science or AI community is that we need to make sure that business stakeholders and other participants in this ecosystem share responsibility for this, and that we're engaged with those groups too. In the context of the commercial world, those are like the risk management functions, the legal functions, et cetera. So I think that we need to make sure this conversation is broader than just our community.
Brilliant. You've all brought up a couple of very important topics that I actually wanted to introduce later on, but this just shows that the debate is flowing well. And one of the points that was pointed out is, I think that not all problems actually need AI to be solved. And it's a matter of correct planning and anticipation on what how the problem should be addressed that is crucial. Another issue is participation of various voices in solving the problem. And I would also like us to remind ourselves of an ancient movie, well, not that ancient, Jurassic Park. I've mentioned it during our discussion, where we have the character of Jeff Goldblum, who is a chaos theorist, who is speaking to the creators of the Jurassic Park that you scientists were so preoccupied with whether or not you could that you didn't stop to think if you should. So there might be some problems with solutions that are feasible, but create bigger problems for the society. So this is leading us to the part where we can focus more on doing what is right. And Rediet, what do you think would be the correct approaches by organizations to increase participation and diversity in solving the problems that they're currently addressing?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I'll say, of all the hard problems that myself and people I work with have been tackling, this has been the most frustrating one. I'll just be honest, because a lot of times when people think about representation and equity and inclusion in the AI space and various industries and academia, whatever you want to look at, it's often thought of as like it's often an afterthought. It's not, it's not mentioned in the very beginning. It's often thought of in very dehumanizing terms. To be quite honest, it's often thought of as like well, it will make us look bad if we are not, meeting certain, compositions or quotas or whatever. It's often thought of as a compromise, which I find to be really disheartening as someone who is, who belongs to many communities that are marginalized within this group. And it's just to the detriment of our scientific advancement, honestly. I think that if we were more representative of society, we'd be asking a broader set of questions. We would have multiple different perspectives available when we're trying to tackle these problems. The harms would be minimized. It's just an overall win. And yet, a lot of times this is thought of as like a sort of risk mitigation, let's improve PR sort of situation. And even when folks are even when there's a little bit more representation than like the bare minimum, oftentimes we neglect to acknowledge that we've created our institutions with specific types of people in mind, whether intentionally or not. That's just the reality of it, right? So, for instance, in many departments, so like at Cornell, I was the first Black woman to graduate with a PhD in computer science. At Berkeley, I'm the first Black woman to be a faculty in the Department of EECS, right? And so these things are often seen as a point of celebration. To me, actually, they're sort of a testament to how slow we have been and how much work we have left in front of us, because these institutions were just not built with folks like me in mind. They were not built with folks who are, not even at the table yet in mind. And so what happens is that people automatically assume, okay, well, you just happen to look different and you happen to have certain different types of demographics, but we don't need to change anything. You're here, that's great. Now we're all set. Right. And that's where the sort of the equity and inclusion comes in, and questions of power specifically come in. So a lot of times what happens is that when folks who are underrepresented show up at these institutions, they see that certain things are just not at all working, then it becomes much easier to label those people difficult. It becomes much easier to say, well, this person is, brings us some points, but I don't really like their tone, or what are they expecting? Shouldn't have they known that, they couldn't really like rattle the system or whatever it is, right? And so it becomes this like rush to minimize and to silence and to ultimately push out people. And I mentioned this, obviously, I think there's the news, there's the news that we've all been reading over the past week, right? But that's, just one case of many things. I was on a call yesterday with a lot of Berkeley faculty who also happen to be Black women, and it was just really disheartening for me to see that once you've been in the academy for a couple of decades, it just really wears on your body and your soul and your your mind, right? And so it's like it's a lose-lose situation. Either you stick around and you're just sort of you really have to like take a huge hit on your physical and mental and emotional health, or you get pushed out or you get kicked out, right? And so I think we really have to think about that. I think that thinking about diversity and inclusion without thinking about power imbalances and who's going to give up power and who's going to actually really revisit structures that we have is just self-serving and inhumane.
Thank you. Yes, we often don't ask ourselves the real questions, and we also only realize them when it's already too late. But there's always time to improve. And perhaps I can relate to Peter's book on AI, which has included the chapters on ethical dilemmas in the 4th edition. When did it come out? Last year, or it took a couple of years ago? Peter.
Yeah. So the first edition of the book was way back in 1995. The 4th edition was last year. The book always had a chapter labeled philosophy that got into some of these ethical issues. But in the earlier editions, it's mostly like John Searle's Chinese room of what does thinking really mean. And in last year's edition, that was changed really radically. So there were definitely changes in the 4th edition. All this deep learning stuff is part of it. But in some ways, I think the ethical issues were maybe even a more important change. And one way of thinking about it is we defined artificial intelligence as saying it's maximizing expected utility. And in the previous editions, we said, well, you give me a utility function. I want to win this game of chess, or I want to correctly label more of this data or whatever. And once you give me the utility function, then I'll tell you all these cool algorithms to achieve what you want. In the 4th edition, we kind of turned that around and said, there's a lot of really good tools now available that you can just use without having to code the algorithm by hand. So maybe the hard part is figuring out what your utility function should be. What is it that you want? And what is it that society as a whole wants? And up to now, we've just been assumed that you were given that. We didn't question that. So that really kind of turns the whole thing on its head in terms of what's important for the field. And we don't have a good sort of technology for figuring out what it is that you want. And, as a society, we even have legends about how bad we are at that, right? So, King Midas was asked, what's your utility function? What do you want to maximize? And he said, well, I want everything I touch to turn to gold. And there was a bug in that specification, right? But if he had known better, there are ways or processes to eliminate some of those bugs, right? So he should have said, I want everything I touch to turn to gold, but I want an undo function. And if he had had that, then he would have been okay, right? And so there are kind of processes that we know to eliminate some of these mistakes. But if you don't have them, then you're in a lot of trouble. And I think we're just beginning to realize these problems we have that are of our own making, and some of the technologies for dealing with them.
Before we wrap up, would you agree that some challenges or apps or fields are currently not adequately addressed in terms of their potential risks and would require a higher level of attention or even regulation? Do we need to maybe level the playing fields on an international level in areas such as remote facial recognition, social scoring, lethal autonomous weapon systems, brain-machine interfaces? What would be your ideas on whether we need to set red lines in some areas? Perhaps Nigel, could you start?
Yeah, thank you. And maybe just real quick, responding to Rediet's point of view, I think we sometimes forget that AI is already kind of part of the critical infrastructure for a lot of how our society functions. It already captures and manages a lot of power, and we did some work with the W20 a few years ago, looking at differential impacts of AI in the context of the workforce with various underrepresented groups. And of course, underrepresented groups tend also to be those who suffer from the biggest differential impact. So it's interesting for me to kind of be on the front line of, as it were, of this social justice challenge that I never anticipated would be part of my career. But this, I think, is really an area where these questions are going to have a huge impact. And it's good that we're talking about them. It's good that the community is talking about them. And it's great that folks like Rediet are pushing that conversation even further, but there's obviously tons more to do. And with regard to regulation, regulation's coming, whether we think it needs to happen or not. I personally do. It is coming. And I think there's, to a certain extent, there's a bit of a race in various jurisdictions to take the lead on regulation. I think it's key for us, from the various constituencies that we represent, to participate in that process and to engage with regulators and legislators to make sure that it goes the right direction. Because to be honest, I think our survey suggests that they also understand this. Regulators today don't have the skills to do this well, and they need our help.
I agree with Nigel completely. Maybe just in addition to what I was saying about Kahai previously, we are a collection of about 150 experts representing 47 member countries and 5 or 6 observer countries, including the US, Canada, Mexico, Israel, and Japan, and also a number of international organizations, civil society, and industry. The idea is to have a multi-stakeholder process from the beginning if you want to have good regulation. But we're skipping over the question that I posed before. Do you see red lines in some areas? And perhaps Nigel or Rediet or Peter?
Yeah, I mean, go ahead, Peter, go ahead.
Okay. I think it would be good to put some brakes on some of the things that are happening. So we saw that when the people in genetic research decades ago said, we're going to stop. We're going to agree. Here's some things we won't do. We won't do experiments on human genomes, and this will be off limits. And I think that was a good idea. And I don't know exactly how to implement that in AI and exactly where it should be. But we should be open to that possibility and make good choices along those lines.
Thank you for this comment, because this is precisely the Oviedo Convention that was adopted by the Council of Europe in the 90s. Rediet, please.
Yeah, I appreciate. I think in terms of just like certainly lethal autonomous systems, I think that should just be a no-go, right? But the way I think about it is that like, there's certain things that you might want to just completely stop, right? I think when it comes to human life or death situation, maybe we shouldn't be so enthusiastic to be involved in that space at all. But other things, I would also say slowing down is good. So usually the way I think about my work, right, because despite being critical of the AI space, my work is actually focused on using artificial intelligence techniques to understand social problems and see how we can actually improve on social problems. So it's actually a very positive use of AI. But the way I think about it oftentimes is that, once I've sort of formulated a question, I think about like, well, in the worst case, who loses and who wins, right? Are you using it to penalize people, or are you using it to give more resources to people, right? And how are you doing that? Who's that shifting power to? Who's that? Are you redistributing, or are you increasing inequalities that already exist, right? And so oftentimes I take a moment to really think very critically about that, and I constantly come back to this question. And so I guess I would say, yes, I think there's all the obvious things that many of us would agree should be like a no-go zone, but I really do think we should also take to heart that we should just slow down and just think about how we're redistributing or not, and when we're tackling these questions.
Excellent.
Going to go in there.
Improvement of quality would come from that. And perhaps we are already getting messages from Stefan. How much time do we have left?
That's time now.
Okay. So with that, I would like to thank the panelists for this interesting debate that could easily go on further. And I would like to thank Reuters Events for organizing the event. To the participants, thank you for all the comments in the chat box. Have a good day. Have a good evening if you're also in Europe. Goodbye.
Wonderful. All right. Thank you so much, everybody, for your time today, and enjoy the rest of your day. I'll hand back to the studio. Goodbye.